Hi everyone. I am so excited to be here and feel so lucky to be going after amazing talks from Natalie and Meredith, where I learned a lot that I did not know before. Um, I think they did such a great job of talking about big systems stuff and then relating that to what people do individually. And I was thinking, oh, what I'm talking about is so much more um, individual and sort of not systems level, but about looking at how we as individual SLPs can be reading and critically appraising the research and thinking about our own thinking. So a bit of a different angle, but I'm really looking forward to talking about this with you. Okay, so a little bit about me and this very old photo that I took at the beginning of COVID, so a long time ago. I have a PhD from the University of Melbourne and I work for the Informed SLP as the pediatric medical editor. So if you read any of our content about pediatric feeding or pediatric voice or dysarthria, I've probably had a hand in that. These are just a couple of the pieces that I've worked on and really enjoyed. I like digging into tricky topics with lots of interesting literature and commentary like orofacial myology and polyvagal theory. Those are a couple that I've looked at recently. And I also work clinically in private practice with children with pediatric feeding disorders. Okay. These are the learning outcomes. You have already seen them. So I'm not going to go into these in detail, but this is sort of my own structure for today's session. I divided it into three different sections. I'm very pleased with how apocalyptic they have ended up sounding. Um, and I think, of these three, we're going to spend the most time on questioning the research. So critically reading research, appraising research, but I also do want to spend some time thinking about AI and also thinking about thinking and thinking about, the ways that we think about research and the way that that might impact on our interpretation, because I think that those make a big difference to how we're navigating the evidence base as evidence-based practitioners. So we'll start with questioning the research. And I guess the reason that I wanted to structure this, around this idea of questioning is because I think, everything about being an evidence-based practitioner and being an educated consumer of research starts with being curious and with feeling confident to ask questions. And I think that that means that we shouldn't be treating research articles like, every paper is, a tablet handed down from a divine source. Research is limited, it's produced by humans, and we make mistakes and so research is cumulative. We're looking at, at the building of knowledge over time, not at every paper as, as a perfect source. And so getting comfortable with that, I think, is really important. So where do we start? If you have a piece of research in front of you, you've downloaded an article or somebody has given you an article, how can you start to figure out whether it is something that is useful, that's of good quality, that's applicable to your practice? A good place to start is just to be able to identify what the source is, if that source is research evidence and if it isn't research evidence, because it's not always as clear cut as it sounds. And I think that there are a lot of people who have perceptions about what evidence is and isn't that are not necessarily correct. So I think, this sort of idea of a scientific source and a source of scientific evidence being complete empirical or high quality review article in a reputable peer reviewed journal as being a scientific source. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But, we can also talk about what it isn't. So an article in an industry magazine might be trustworthy, it might be valuable, it might be helpful to you in your practice, but it's not research evidence per se. An article that's in the media, like in the newspaper or online or in a magazine, isn't research evidence. Something that's self-published, like a monograph or a blog post, even if it sort of is titled a case study or a review, doesn't sort of meet that criteria of being research evidence. what someone says in a workshop or a podcast. I loved Natalie's wording around professional developments earlier, if you were there for that. So even if somebody says like research shows or my research shows, even if they're talking about their own research, that's still not primary research evidence. It's a secondary source. So, and then other secondary sources are, like textbooks or commentaries. There can also be articles that are published, but they're published in what are called predatory journals. And these are journals that can have like unethical publication practices that don't have good quality control. So maybe they're accepting fees to publish articles, but they're not actually peer reviewing or quality controlling what they're publishing. They're just doing it as a way of making money. So those articles are not good scientific sources. And then there's also this sort of middle section where we might not have quite as much confidence that the source is scientific, but maybe it's worth sort of thinking about or looking into a little bit more. So something like a presentation at a conference or a poster at a conference where it hasn't gone through the peer review process that a journal article would have, but it has passed some quality checks. A preprint, which is the draft copy of a scientific article before it's been fully peer reviewed, a standalone abstract without the full paper attached, or a scientific article in a journal that you're not sure of. And we can talk a little bit more about how to identify which journals are reputable as well. So those are like our non-scientific or grey area sources where we're figuring out whether something actually sort of qualifies as research evidence or not. But let's talk more about what research evidence is. So you've got your paper. The first thing that's good to think about is this complete? So if you only have the abstract, which I think a lot of us can fall into this trap, particularly because articles are often paywalled. And if you're buying articles, if you're buying a lot of articles, it can get very expensive very quickly. But if you're looking at just the abstract or the highlights or an excerpt, it's not complete. We don't have all the information. So it's really hard to evaluate it as a reliable scientific source. Does this evidence describe research that's been completed by the authors of the paper? So an original study like an RCT or a case study or a systematic review, rather than like a commentary or an opinion piece or an editorial. So those types of articles are published by journals. So they look in lots of ways the same as empiric evidence, but they're not independent empiric evidence on their own. And then looking at whether it's from a reputable peer-reviewed journal. So we'll all be familiar with some reputable peer-reviewed journals: the Journal of Speech, Language and Hearing Research, the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology, the Journal of Pediatrics, Dysphagia. And the more you read in your area of practice, the more you'll recognize the names of reputable journals. If you don't recognize the name of a journal, that's fine. There are lots of good journals that we might not immediately recognize. You can check out the journal's website to see who runs it if you're not sure and you're wanting to do a bit of sort of quality checking. PubMed has a journal list of what journals they index. If the journal is on there, it suggests it's more likely to be a decent source. There's a list called Beall's List, which includes the names of lots of predatory journals. So if it's on that list, it's less likely to be a good source. So I think that's a good starting point for deciding, like, is this research evidence to start with, or is it something else and needs to be evaluated on different criteria? And then you can read the paper. And I do think that lots of people get stuck or overwhelmed or intimidated at this step, which is very understandable. Research is written in a really inaccessible way. It's very jargony. It can be very dense and kind of off-putting if you don't do it a lot. So for some of you, this is going to be preaching to the converted. I know we have people here who are academics. I know we have lots of TISLP staff here who read research articles all the time. But if this is not something that you're as familiar with, or if it does feel a little bit intimidating, I just want to sort of get you oriented to what this sort of format looks like. It might have been a while since you've read a paper. So most research papers will follow this broad sort of IMRAD structure. There's an abstract up the top where the researchers try to summarize the key points of their research. There's an introduction, which is where you get the context for the research and the research questions and or hypotheses. There's the methods where the researchers talk about what they did and how they went about it. The results where they tell us their findings, and the discussion where they interpret their findings, talk about the strengths and the limitations of their research, and usually talk about next steps, like what we still need to figure out. And they will always say more research needed, because research is cumulative. There is always more research needed, but it's interesting as well, because sometimes when I talk to people about research papers, if they are not regularly reading research papers, they say, oh, well, they said in the conclusion that more research is needed, so maybe it's not a very good paper because they haven't, fully answered the question. But this is just a standard thing that you say at the end of a research paper. You identify the next directions and identify that no one paper is strong enough to completely definitively answer a question forever. When you are reading a research paper, it is okay not to read the entire thing top to bottom in sequence. You can read research articles however it works for you. You can print them out and have them on paper. You can use an electronic copy. You can get some software that will read it aloud for you. You can use post-it notes, highlighters, voice notes, underlining. You can read the sections in whatever order you like. My personal way of reading research articles, just by way of an example, is that I usually start with the results, because I want to know whether the entire paper is going to be worthwhile for me to read, and because I'm the sort of person who reads the synopses of movies on Wikipedia before I see the movie. The results is where I'm going to find that information, and then I'll often read the discussion. Then I'll often go back to the methods, then go back to the discussion again, sometimes go back to the introduction, or at least part of it, and I just keep jumping around based on what I need to know to really have a handle on this piece of evidence. And I'm often typing up notes as I go, because that's how I like to sort of process and think about what I'm considering in this particular paper. That's not the right way to read research, because there isn't a right way to read research. There's lots of ways to read and consume research, and you'll figure out what feels right to you as you practice and as you read more. And I just think it's really important when you're reading research, especially if it's something that is new to you, to do this regularly, that you just give yourself permission not to understand every single word of the research. It doesn't make you bad at reading research, because I can tell you that I have a PhD, I read a lot of research, I've published my own research, and I still don't understand all the statistical and technical terms that I read in research papers, and neither does anyone else. So just, being able to let go of that expectation that every word of every research paper is going to be completely transparent and intelligible to you, I think is a really good step. By all means, highlight the unfamiliar terms, go and look them up, try and build your understanding. I think that's a really important way to improve your understanding and improve your research literacy. But you don't need to write yourself off as, a consumer of research because you don't have a complete knowledge of Bayesian inferencing or multicollinearity or some of these other, tricky technical terms. You still get lots out of reading research. Okay. So you've read the paper, and then you sort of move on to considering what you thought of the paper. So what questions it raised for you. And if you're used to thinking of research papers as perfect, error-free, incontrovertible, it can be hard to come up with questions. And I remember, particularly before I did my PhD, when I was working full-time as a speech pathologist, but I was accessing journal articles for quality projects like, developing group interventions or advocating for changes within the workplace where I did have this sort of this attitude that if it was published, it must be something pretty close to perfect. So I think for a lot of people, they know, of course, research is not perfect, but I do really remember in my own sort of career history, having this position that something was published was up on this pedestal, and that who was I to be able to critique it and to be able to question it. And of course I can. Of course I could. I'm a clinician. I have knowledge and expertise, just as you all have amazing knowledge and expertise. And I think, recognizing your competence to ask questions of research that you're reading is a really important part of being an informed and educated consumer of research. So these are some sort of things that you might be considering when you are evaluating research. So thinking about, what is the study design? Is this a qualitative piece of research that's interested in people's opinions, views, experiences, or is it quantitative, where they're looking at numbers and proportions and effect sizes? Is it retrospective, where they're looking back over data that has already been collected? So, for example, looking back over clinical files for clients that were seen without necessarily the intention of them being in a research study, or was it prospective data where they designed the study first and then collected the data? Is it an intervention study where they're actually, delivering a therapy or an intervention and looking at the effect, or is it more sort of observational and looking at, maybe the etiology of an issue or the profile of a particular group? Thinking about the study size. So I think this is sort of an easy first port of call for a lot of people when they're starting to ask questions about and critique research, is to look at study sizes. There can be excellent studies that are smaller, and there can be very flawed studies that are larger, but it's always worth considering the size of the study. Considering who is being studied. So a lot of the populations that are researched they're often convenience samples. I think probably the groups of people and children who happen to live near to research universities are overstudied compared to people who live in areas that are not close to researchers. And I think, so actually looking at the makeup of the populations, the makeup of the participants in the study, and thinking about that group in comparison to like a representative population, but also in relation to the specific population that you're working with, and thinking about how that might make differences to how the results relate to the people that you're working with, I think is really important and relevant. Assessment and measurement methods, really important to consider as well. So, a lot of the time researchers will, for various reasons, create their own measures in research papers, or they might use measures that are not the same measures that we might choose to use in a best practice clinical scenario. So considering that, I think, is really important. When I did my PhD, I was looking at development in children born preterm. One of the papers I published, we looked at language outcomes at a certain time point, and the data that we had for that time point was the Bayley scales. I don't think the Bayley scales are the best measure of language. So my expectation would be that when people are looking at that data, they're like, oh, okay, well, she used the Bayley scales to measure language. And, and that's maybe not the most complete way of measuring language in children. So what does that mean for those results? What does that mean for how it relates to the children that I'm seeing? If it is an intervention paper, considering how completely the intervention is described, and would you be able to replicate that? Could you read the paper and go away and actually implement that intervention yourself? Or is it in fairly broad terms? Are there confounding factors? So could anything else have caused the effects seen in the study other than the intervention or the exposure that the researchers are sort of hypothesizing is causing the effects that are being seen? Conflicts of interest, I think this is another one that lots of people are pretty familiar with looking for, but looking at whether any of the authors of the paper have any financial gain associated, or other types of gain associated with the results of the paper. So, for example, are they being paid by a company that makes the product that they're studying in the paper, and how might that influence how they designed the study, or what they are and not reporting. Remembering that statistical significance and importance are not the same thing. So you'll see this idea of statistical significance in a lot of quantitative research projects, where they will look at the difference between two groups, and they'll say, well, there was a statistically significant difference, say, after this intervention. And statistical significance can be driven by things other than like the magnitude of the change. So if you have a really, really large group of participants, for example, in a study, and you do a really intensive intervention over a really long period of time, and on average, that participant group has an increase of, like, say, 1 point on the self, that could be a statistically significant difference. Is an increase of 1 point on the self a clinically significant difference? Does it make a difference to the quality of life of that child, their educational engagement, any other sort of those meaningful metrics? Maybe, maybe not. So just remembering that those things are not necessarily the same thing, I think is important for us when we're appraising. And then thinking about how the paper fits into the research literature as a whole. So, one paper is just one paper. Ideally, when we're looking at the literature, we're looking for like scientific consensus. And so if we read a paper that disagrees with an entire body of literature, that could be the first step in sort of a brand new finding that is paradigm shifting and changes things completely for the profession. Or it could be an indication that there is something in the paper that drove a difference that isn't necessarily representative of the whole scientific body of literature. So that's important to consider. So find your questions and write them down, and then try and find the answers. You try and find the answers in the paper to start with. You might go, oh, well, what was the background of the people in the study, and maybe that's in the paper, and then you can answer that question straight away. Maybe you can't answer that question straight away, and maybe what you've uncovered there is a limitation in the paper, or maybe it's an indication that you need to read more widely and go away and find some other research papers. But I think this process of asking questions is really at the core of being able to critically read, appraise, and apply evidence. You might be somebody who likes more structure when they're appraising evidence, for right now or for always. There are some really great appraisal tools out there, specifically designed to help people like us read research critically. These are a few examples of paper-based research appraisal checklists. The CASPS checklist, the ones from the Joanna Briggs Institute, Equator Peer Review tools, and the CEBM checklists. All free. There are different ones depending on the design of the study that you're looking at. So those are all really great to use. If you have a journal club, you can use them in the journal club. You can also just use them solo. Understanding Health Research was a great website that steps you through reading a paper and what to look at. I went to access it yesterday just to double check, and it looks like it has been taken down, and it looks like that might be because the University of Glasgow that used to run this website has pulled funding from the unit that runs it. I emailed them to see if it's going to be coming back up. I hope it will be, but if not, the paper-based checklists are excellent as well. AI as a electronic research appraisal tool, we're going to talk about in more detail in a minute. And then there are also some standalone tools that some of you might be familiar with, like the hierarchy of evidence, that can be helpful for understanding some specific aspects of research and appraising specific aspects of research. So, got to mention this guy, and those like them. So this is an example of a hierarchy of evidence pyramid. I think that probably most SLPs will have seen something along these lines at some point during their studies or professional lives. This type of pyramid is one tool that you can use to help you to interpret the design of a study and to determine how prone to bias that study might be. It's not a standalone quality measure. This is not like it's not the one ring of research interpretation. It's not like the single thing that's going to tell you whether a study is good or not, or useful or not, or relevant or not. It's just one dimension, one aspect of interest. So it is helpful, but it's we don't want to sort of begin and end here, because there are some really terrible systematic reviews and meta-analyses out there, and there are some really excellent case series and case reports that have really great information to share. So I think I just sort of want to encourage you to use this, but use it knowing that it's not the be all and end all of research appraisal. Okay. Let's talk about AI. Does AI have a role in research? Too late. It's already here. So yeah, like in most industries, it's too late to ask whether AI has a role in research because it's already being used extensively for doing research and for consuming research. So and even whether you want to use AI or you don't want to use AI, you probably already are using AI. Surprise. Even if you don't consider yourself an early adopter, tools that you use are using AI. So you're already in the web of AI, even if you're not sort of actively trying to use it. These are just a few examples of AI that might be used to read, critique, or summarize research for SLPs. So I would say most commonly for sort of most SLPs that are actively using AI, they're probably using something like ChatGPT or Claude, because those are the ones that are most accessible and most widely used at the moment. But there is also a range of more research and health specific tools. So, some examples of research specific tools would be things like Elicit, Consensus, Google Scholar Labs, Open Paper, or SciSpace. There's lots of tools being developed. These are just a few examples. It's not a complete list. And then health specific tools. So Open Evidence is an example where it's marketed mostly to doctors as an AI that can support them with clinical decision making based on accessing research evidence, clinical guidelines, those sorts of things. And then there's that AI behind the curtain. So the AI that's being used to power your search engines, your social media, lots of other invisible aspects of our lives. That's why we're using AI, even if we don't mean to be. Hard to opt out entirely, impossible maybe at this point. So since we're all using AI, let's think about some of the benefits and drawbacks that it might have. The major benefit of AI in the context of research, interpretation, or consumption is that it's an incredibly powerful tool for easy and efficient searching, which means that it can help us to synthesize an enormous amount of information much more quickly than we would be able to on our own. But we need to be aware of what AI can't do or what it does badly. So these are a few examples, again, not complete, but a starting point when I was starting to think about this and also reading about the application of AI in research consumption. So a huge one that's really important to be aware of is that AI hallucinates, and that means that it tells you things that are not true. It makes things up. And usually it makes things up in a really confident and plausible way so that it's quite difficult to spot that it's completely wrong. And this includes making up fake citations and making up references that sound real but are not real. So I think I have particularly had this experience with large language models, but really important to be aware that just because AI gives you this information or says something, that doesn't mean that it's true. We need to be really careful about checking that. AI absorbs the biases around it. It uses statistical learning, which means that it, is looking at lots of different sources of information and just looking at sort of the most likely combinations and the most likely information. So that means that it is absorbing bias, and then bias is going to be coming back out again. It's not an unbiased source. It may not have access to paywalled sources. I would say in most instances, it probably doesn't have access to journal articles that are not open access, for example. So I was having a look. There's a clinical note AI that's quite widely used in Australia, and they've recently been advertising themselves as also a potential source of evidence-based information because they are crawling journal databases, but they don't seem to have access to anything that's behind the paywall. So that means that they're going to be crawling abstracts and open access articles, and that is a very, very small percentage of what research evidence is actually available. So it's really important to know that they are drawing from a very limited set of sources in that case, not a complete set of sources. Currently, AI mostly uses statistical processing, which means that it's looking for what's most likely to be true or what is most common based on data patterns. It can't really understand concepts. It's not really thinking about or considering or understanding. It doesn't have that conceptual processing or understanding. So we shouldn't be relying on it for that. There are lots of concerns in academia that AI might be contributing to intellectual passivity. So we've just talked about how it's hard to read research. It feels hard. It can be overwhelming. It can take a lot of work and practice. But when you practice things, you get better at them. And if you don't practice them, you don't get better at them. So if you get used, for example, to, getting a research article, reading the first few lines, going, wow, this feels really difficult, and then plugging it into AI and saying, hey, Claude, whatever, what does this mean for me? Then you're not practicing that process of reading and interpreting and thinking about concepts. And so you're not going to get better at it. You get used to sort of passing that challenge off to technology rather than developing the skills that you need to navigate that. And I think that could be a really major limitation. There's also criticisms of AI in terms of having lots of potential for harm to humans and environments, and we don't have the guardrails to prevent that yet. So that's sort of a broader limitation. There's lots of information in lots of different places that you can read more about that. And there will be other limitations that we come to understand as the technology evolves and we learn more about it. But also a lot of these limitations will probably be addressed and improved upon. So it's a rapidly moving area. These are some experiences that I had, just to be illustrative. I will make the point that AI systems are improving. So some of the problems that I had 6 months ago will already be fixed. But I just think it's useful to have some illustrations of benefits and drawbacks that I have found in my personal experience. I started with trying to use ChatGPT. I was preparing a presentation. I wanted to make sure that I was being as thorough as possible. I'd already listed out a bunch of oral motor assessment tools to speak about, and I wanted ChatGPT to check if I'd missed any. So I asked it. It hallucinated a bunch of tools that did not exist. And luckily, I'm familiar enough with the literature and with this area of practice that I could go, oh, I don't recognize the name of that tool. Where are you getting that information? And it gave me a citation. And then I was like, I've read that paper. I don't think it mentioned that. And it was like, huh, you know what? You're right. It's not there. Sorry. But then it continued to hallucinate and miscite even after I had said that doesn't exist. That paper doesn't say that. So that was not, I think, a particularly successful or confidence building experience. I have used Google Scholar Labs as a beta tester when that first came out, and I'm still using it to find relevant papers on a topic that I was researching. It did a pretty good job of finding the top most relevant papers and pulling out the takeaway applications to the topic that I was looking at. So I was pretty pleased with Google Scholar Lab. I've played around with Elicit as well to generate citation lists and consensus statements. And I looked at two different topics. One topic was quite narrow and there wasn't much literature on it. It pulled up some good citations, and the consensus statement was pretty reasonable. For the other topic, which was really broad, really multidisciplinary, there was a lot of literature to go through. The consensus statement was not accurate, and it missed most of the most relevant citations and gave me citations that were like marginally relevant. So I think there are some interesting takeaways in terms of using specific versus general tools, in terms of being able to check whether something is, whether the information that you're getting from AI is correct or not. Particularly because as these tools improve as well, they're still going to make mistakes, but the mistakes are probably going to get more subtle and more difficult to recognize. And that creates some real challenges for us. So if you are using AI, be intentional and thoughtful about where and when you're using it. If you're using it for research purposes, try and use research-specific tools. Try and lean away from ChatGPT or Claude or other broad large language models and try and use those more, the tools that are designed more for research, because they are probably going to do a better job. They're probably going to hallucinate a little bit less. If you're using AI, try and use it for efficiency, so to do what you could do but faster, for completeness and checking your work, not for understanding, not for conceptualization, not for like thinking. You can use it as a thinking partner, like go back and forth, try and pick holes in your own thinking, but you shouldn't be using it as a tool for conceptual understanding, because that's not what it's designed to do. Being a good AI prompter is going to really help you to use it effectively as well. So really being really specific, being really well defined in your questions and prompts. And there are structures online that you can use for prompting AI. This is one example, persona, aim, recipients, theme, structure. You can Google AI prompting and use that terminology if you'd like to know more about AI prompting. And always, 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 I can't emphasize enough, check what AI tells you. I was looking at social media recently. I was looking at a social media post from someone, and the social media post was about a topic area that I'm very familiar with, and they had listed some information and cited a couple of papers, and I didn't recognize the names of the papers, but they looked highly relevant to my areas of clinical interest, so I really wanted to read them. So I went looking for those papers and I couldn't find them, and I checked in lots of different ways, and I actually got Molly from TISLP to help me check as well, and she couldn't find them either. And eventually I messaged the people who had created this social media post and just said, hey, I'd really love to read these papers. I haven't been able to find them. Do you have a link or something for me? And they took a couple of days, and then they got back to me and said, I'm so sorry, that was an error, and the post got taken down. And I think it's pretty likely that that was AI generated content that hadn't been checked. So just make sure that you're checking for your sort of own credibility and consistency, but also to make sure that you are accurate in anything that you're applying to clinical populations. Okay, the last little bit that we're going to talk about is questioning yourself, because we are the common sort of denominator in all the research articles that we read, and all of us have a specific lens or a specific perspective that we're bringing to what we're doing. And I think it's really important to have this sort of element of metacognition and being able to think about our own thinking if we're going to be informed and thoughtful consumers of research. So thinking about biases and fallacies, I think, is a really useful structure for this. Biases and fallacies are universal. Everyone has them. They are what happens when we try and run like really complex software, like the program that is being an SLP, or surviving the information onslaught of the 21st century, on hardware that hasn't been updated for several tens of thousands of years, and which was originally developed to live in communities of like 60 people catching fish and dodging bears. They're what our brain does when it's reaching for efficiencies, but they make us worse at logical thinking. So when we're trying to do something really complex, like interpret and appraise research, we need to recognize and challenge our biases and fallacies, so that we can become more accurate, logical, rational, reasonable thinkers. So thinking about what those biases and fallacies might look like for SLPs reading the research, I'm just going to give you some examples of common examples of biases and fallacies to look out for in your own thinking, colleagues' thinking, online discussion, anywhere where clinical issues and research is being discussed. False cause is probably one of the most common ones we see, and we see it in research papers as well as in discussions and in our own thinking. So the idea of false cause is that if there is a relationship between two things, we can often assume that one is the cause of the other, but that doesn't necessarily follow. That's not necessarily the case. So, this paper showed that lots of children start stuttering after they start kindergarten, so kindergarten must cause stuttering. So no, that's not necessarily a causal relationship. It might just be that the age that children start kindergarten is the same age that they happen to start stuttering, and there's a completely different explanation. Or it might be a real relationship, but the fact that they happen together is not enough evidence for us to say that one causes the other. Confirmation bias, we all tend to seek out and favor information that confirms what we already believe. So like, I know oral motor exercises work for speech kids. I don't need to read these papers that say that they don't work because I already know that they do work. But I am going to read these papers that are coming out that say they do work because I know that those ones are true. So I'm going to spend more time on that research rather than the stuff that I know not to be true. We're all very susceptible to confirmation bias. Sunk cost bias, we don't like to let go of beliefs or practices that we've already invested a bunch of time and energy in. If you've ever been to a course, like a multi-day course, really expensive course, you've done the whole course and maybe you've even applied it for a while, and then it's either been debunked or you've started to see that maybe it's not working exactly the way you expect. It's really hard to let go of that because you're like, oh, but I spent so much time and energy and money on this. It's really difficult. But if the evidence is saying that you need to let go of it, we do need to let go of it, but it is hard to do because we've sunk cost into it. Groupthink. I think SLPs were very agreeable as a profession. We really value social cohesion, and it's really hard to risk social standing or engage in conflict if the social dynamics of the group favor a certain perspective. So if everyone around you thinks a certain kind of way or does things a certain kind of way, it's really hard to be the person who's like, I think that's wrong, and I think we need to change it and do it differently. And I think, a lot of Natalie's talk tapped into this as well. It's really, really challenging. But recognizing when we are, when we're holding a certain type of belief because it's true and reasonable and we have good evidence for it versus because the people around us also believe that and it's really hard to rock the boat is really important. Backfire effects. If you are challenged in a belief, you are more likely to double down in that belief. So you're more likely to experience it as a personal attack and then start rejecting evidence that might help you to move forward. And that's a natural thing that happens to us all, like, oh, I don't really like bananas. What are you talking about? Bananas are the best. No, bananas are disgusting. I hate them. You can get more extreme in your beliefs once those beliefs are challenged. So being able to observe that response in yourself and break it down is really important. Appeal to authority. If someone in authority says something, it must be true. We know that that's not the case, but we're still susceptible to think that if a professor said something or if a workshop presenter said something, that it must be true. And I think that now as well, we've had this massive shift in the last 10, 15 years to a lot more social media influencers in the SLP world. And there's some sort of assumed authority from people who are disseminating information from accounts, from social media accounts. Um, we sort of, yeah, assume that certain amount of authority, and that gives their sort of what they're saying an authoritative ring, and we're more likely to believe it. And it's just important to be able to question it. It might still be true. It's not wrong because someone in authority said it, but we just need to be able to be critical either way. And then this, I think, is just common in SLP and child development more. I think sort of because I work in pediatrics, I think I probably see this quite a lot, this appeal to nature. Like if something is natural, it must be good. If it's unnatural, it must be bad. I think is just a good one to be aware of in the broader health context. Okay, so we have these biases. What do we do about them? I think the first thing is that bias gets thrown around as an insult a lot in online discussion. So I think a really good first step is to stop throwing it around as an insult and just recognize that we all have biases. I have biases, you have biases, everyone here has biases. It is human to be biased. We are all biased. The trick is learning to recognize it in yourself and being able to slow down your thinking so that you can question those biases when they arrive. And that involves being able to be humble and being able to admit when you're wrong, which is really hard. That is an ongoing area of development that I'm actively tackling still. Seeking diverse perspectives with an open mind is also part of that. Looking for people, like actively looking for people who disagree with your position, and really trying to understand and empathize with their position is really important. You might still end up holding the same opinions and holding the same position as you did before, but it will be a stronger position than it was before because you've done the work to understand it and be able to defend it. So, in case you hadn't guessed, the key message here that I want you to take away in regards to critically reading and appraising the research is to stay really curious. Keep asking lots of questions about everything. One final question today, like it's a taster, but there's always more to learn. Meredith and Natalie both had such amazing, dense presentations. There is so much more to learn about jobs. There's so much more to learn about implementation. There's always more to learn. It's exciting and overwhelming sometimes. I am a big fan of learning by doing. So I think do just practice, just get some research articles that are about things that you're passionate about or interested in. Read some papers, use some of those appraisal tools, and you'll get better at it like we do when we practice anything. If you're interested in more structured learning, there are MOOCs, massive online open courses that can be really handy. There are quite a lot about research appraisal and reading health research specifically. Workplace journal clubs can be really helpful for learning together. Supervision and mentoring, if you have access to somebody who can support you with research appraisal, can be really helpful. Or you can get involved in research as well. Be a research assistant, collaborate with some researchers at your local universities or colleges. Or get a PhD. I loved my PhD. Not everyone, has the time and money to get a PhD, I know, but it was pretty great. But getting involved in research is one way that you can increase your research literacy and confidence.